when we go through this, we need to understand we're only focused so far on probably about 20% of the carbon emissions. So there's still a long way to go. So that's the journey that we've got to deliver NHS Carbon Footprint Plus. So this is taken from a piece of work we did at University College London Hospital. So it's best practice. It's a piece of work which, in order to understand how you're going to manage carbon, we need to understand roles and responsibilities. So in a facilities management perspective, what is Mitie delivering and what is the trust or third parties delivering? So this just shows how important that is. But if we're looking at the green inner circle, basically that's gas, electric, it's waste and it's water. That's part of the carbon footprint that Mitie was responsible for looking after. It's also part of the UCLH green plan baseline. The outer circle beyond that is still some items that come into the NHS carbon footprint. So that's that bit that was still on the left-hand side and the bit that I say we've really been working on intensively. And then you've got the other outer circle, still in white, which is the NHS Carbon Footprint Plus. And this is the area where, till now, not a significant amount of work's been done. And then everything in the green circle outside of that, from a Mitie perspective, is out of scope. But the message to take from this is understand scope and understand how, as an organisation with all your business partners, how you get into to deliver net zero carbon. So I just wanted to briefly show sort of like where we've got to with UCLH and why we consider it best practice. So if you remember when we were talking about the NHS carbon footprint, that has an 80% milestone carbon reduction target by 2028. And you can see here in the bubble on the far right-hand side that actually we got to that in 2021. And basically, I've just got another slide after this is how did we do that? So you can see the light green is carbon emissions associated with electricity in the main, and the dark green is gas, and there is a little bit of oil in there. But these are all, as we say, carbon footprint, operational carbon savings. Okay, this is interesting. So this is the journey to NHS Carbon Footprint Plus. So how did we get to that 8% carbon reduction saving at UCLH? Because by 2021, we've effectively met the milestone target that's in place for 2028. So it started off with carbon footprint and quick wins. We then looked at how do we collate the data that we need in order to sort of drill down and understand where there is waste in the system and where there's abatement opportunities. Then taking those opportunities and identifying them and delivering them, and then looking for further options. So basically, what we've got here is above the dotted line, everything there is carbon footprint. And at UCLH, our journey, as we said, we're meeting the carbon footprint target, milestone target for 2028. What have we done to date? So probably the biggest thing we did was we moved to green electricity procurement, and that was about a 67% reduction in CO2. But even in addition to that, as quick wins, we still looked at LED and solar PV. So despite the fact that we've already got zero carbon from an electricity perspective, we're still driving electrical projects forward because there's cost savings and there's just operability sort of like reasons why we should continue to do that. If we looked at the improved metering, so there's been there's about 250 meters put in there. That gives us the detail. If we look at some of the energy efficiency options we were able to take forward from the data that we gained, we were able to make some great business cases in life cycle for things like motor replacement, moving to EC motors and move into direct drive air handling units. And beyond that, it's key and important that we take that data and look at further options. So we have looked at a number of further options. We have looked at air source heat pumps for this site. At the moment, we could only look at it for domestic hot water because the boilers are a long way off being end of life. So we considered taking the water off the space heating. That's not possible at that site because they haven't got the outdoor space available. This is an inner city hospital. It's a tower block and it's got a very small roof area. We've looked at other things, so like Novalu, which is water reduction, and there's other things in there. But the key point that I want you to take from this is on the journey to NHS carbon footprint, we've got an 80% reduction, beyond 80% reduction, on the carbon footprint part of the NHS targets, and that is only 20% of the total. So going forward, we've still got a significant amount of work. And when we start looking at the carbon footprint plus, what we're starting to look at is we're starting to look at indirect scope 3 emissions. And when we're looking at those, things like ppm 0621, which is carbon reduction pathway compliance within procurement for NHS clients, that is going to be key. And really what I want to do is I want to bring my colleague Lorcan in to discuss that and continue to take you through the NHS Carbon Footprint Plus and what do we need to do going forward.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So as Gareth has kindly introduced me, my name is Lorcan Anglin, by the way. It's just a phonetic spelling, so just spell it as it looks. So one of the things which we do need to be aware of is that so many clients are now at the position where they've started to implement their Scope 1 and Scope 2 reductions, which is great. And that's obviously something which needs to go on the way, and we need to move forward as quickly as we can on those. And that's that left-hand side of this particular diagram. The right-hand side, although it doesn't actually show it here, is actually 80% of the picture. The Scope 3 is 80% of the carbon emissions which are related to the hospital and the healthcare services. So it's not just something which is a made-up number. These are very directly and can be attributed to the healthcare services. So at the minute, we've got an 80% reduction on a 20% of the picture, and we now need to apply and look at the 80% of the carbon emissions that are now need to be dealt with. Obviously, in a slightly longer period, for that's going to be by 2045 is the general plan. So just to quickly go into explain what Scope 3 emissions are. Scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions, but which are intrinsic to the organisation's operation. So they are still very much associated with its activities. They come from the supply chain, transportation, waste disposal, equipment that is purchased, the pharmaceuticals and the chemicals, all of which appear outside of or manufactured outside of the hospital and then come into the hospital. All of the emissions related to those are very much part of the involvement of the healthcare services. They're quite challenging to measure because they're quite often outside your own control. Where you've got control, and as Gareth was suggesting, stick in meters and get lots of information about your own operation, but these Scope 3 emissions are outside of your control, or outside of your building, outside of your direct involvement. So therefore, you need to be clear about making sure that people are all using a common means of measurement. So you can go from one place to another and be able to identify that there's a common approach to what that is. And here's the kind of thing which is quite appealing from a healthcare services, is that, and it depends how you want to look at this, but I look upon it as this is stewardship. Healthcare services are stewardship for our society. And for that, we need to take responsibility for actually going after these 80% of carbon emissions and make sure that all of the suppliers to healthcare services are playing the game, are actually understanding what it is they need to do, because ultimately that's how you're going to get to the position you want to be in terms of reducing these carbon emissions. So depending on which level you want to go at it is really important. So just to give an example of the thing, I won't spend a lot of time going through these, is there are 15 categories of Scope 3. And you can quickly go through these, you can see and kind of understand them. So these are the purchase goods and services of your supplier, capital goods of your supplier, fuel and energy use of your supplier. So these are not your own use, because that's under Scope 1 and Scope 2. The ones in light blue, in my eyes, they're part of what's called the carbon reduction plan, which is a regulation that's been applied to all suppliers to the NHS from the 1st of April 2023. And they need to provide all of these information in light blue as part of getting a contract with the NHS. Can't get it without this from 1st of April 2023. So a very important extension of Scope 3 information that's now being required to be delivered to the NHS for them to be able to make contract decisions. So, as we said, is that Scope 3 is 78%, was not actually the indirect emissions, the emissions. That second point, the reference about the any contracts above £5 million per annum from the 1st of April 2023 means that any new contracts are going to be under this. Okay, they are going to need to be dealt with as part of that. So your suppliers are going to have to be aware of that and also be able to include that properly, and therefore in terms of being able to make use of that information is going to be very useful as a source of information for you to be able to develop your own Scope 3 information going forward in understanding what it is your suppliers are actually delivering in order to obtain that particular contract. There are other major things happening from a regulation point of view in the next few months, basically. One, we've got from the 1st of October 2023, the EU is going to impose what it calls the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And essentially what that's saying is we want to know what is the carbon content of everything that's coming into the EU. Now that forces everybody to have to come up with that information in order to deliver that to whatever it is they're delivering it to. Now at the minute, it's not a cost thing, because they're just wanting to identify what kind of information it is, so you have to report for the next 3 months. But by 2028, I think, they will start charging. So therefore, it's going to become something which is very important that suppliers are going to have to be aware of in order to deal with. That's the cost of doing business. In the UK, in 2024, 10,000 UK companies are now going to have to do net zero assessments. So this is the private sector, and it's the system called ESOS, Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme. And then by next July, the government has announced they will issue sustainable disclosure standards. So again, all of these things coming as pressure, but it does make it a lot easier for those who are in public sector, whatever, to be able to garner this information in order to be able to make use of it for their own purposes, in order to identify which of their suppliers are actually on the pathway that the NHS might be looking for in order to ensure that that occurs. Just to be sure, it's very common across Europe. In 2024, Europe is putting in some similar kinds of sustainable disclosure standards, and there's going to be 50,000 companies captured in the EU. As it happens, those particular standards are actually slightly more stringent in terms of what's being asked for. But that's what's happening in the next 6 months in terms of what's happening to the regulatory system for the private sector, certainly, but obviously we know very well there's pressures on the public sector as well in terms of being able to match these. But so it's happening in lots of different places. Okay, so just to go through on particular, spend a bit of time on this carbon reduction plans to PPN 0621. So again, it's easy for you to pick up and see what that is. And it allows these particular suppliers to get to grips with what it is they need to provide you with and start working on what are their hotspots. Many of them know what the hotspots are and can start doing it, but they're having to disclose what they are, so it's more visible for everybody else to be able to see who are the people, who are the suppliers that I can make use of in terms of helping get my particular carbon emissions down. And as you probably recognise, in lots of different companies in lots of different ways, an efficient business is a good business to be doing business with. And that's really an important part of that. If they're providing good carbon reduction plans, sticking to them, because it's not just about getting a contract. You then need to keep monitoring what your performance actually is. Are you actually sticking to the pathway you've established in these carbon reduction plans? So again, that's something that's going to be coming into, and the government's simple ethos is, we're committing to net zero, so we expect all those supplying the public sector need to be at least buying into what that particular plan is. So that's the general thrust behind it. So what I'm doing today, I mean, this may come as a surprise, but the answer for Scope 3 is engagement. Because as I've explained, 80% of the emissions is being delivered or emitted by suppliers. So you don't have direct control over it. So the important thing and the way to approach that particular group is engagement. You can't control them. You can't decide. You're able to do up your Scope 1 and 2 because you can take the decision to say we will change lights, we will change our heating system. But when it comes to suppliers, you don't have quite the same strength in terms of being able to do that. So the way to do that is an engagement strategy. Just to show, Mitie also can do foundations workshops, implementation strategy workshops, metrics and targets workshops, and governance workshops. So we're not just a one-trick pony in this particular area. All of these things are means to generate the kind of strategy, because at the end of the day, what is a strategy? A target is not a strategy. We need to backfill whatever that target is aimed at doing, as to what the strategy is going to be in order to get to that particular point. Okay, so the engagement program. These are very important ones. When you look at the fact that it's 80%, that transition is not going to be achieved by one sector alone. We all need to partner up with this in terms of what it is. And obviously, Mitie regards itself as a very good partner in terms of doing it, and it's just a very natural extension for us to get involved in this type of partnership. So you may want to strategically prioritize your engagement efforts, because you will look at, when you see the range of Scope 3 emissions and where they all sit. They sit in, like I say, the pharmaceuticals and the chemicals. It may also be in the equipment. It may also be in other services, depending on what your particular Scope 3 emissions are, to decide what are the hotspots that you need to be going after in order to be able to do that. And then addressing, so how are we going to do that? So there's lots of information out there now in terms of identifying what level of Scope 3 emissions may be in a particular area. But the question is not, how do I engage with somebody to get those reduced? Okay, so really, to get back to that, one thing is we would definitely agree with is the key steps to get your board as part of it. Running workshops in order to try and get as many functions involved in terms of what it is you might be doing, because that's a very key element that we know works. We've got the collecting the data, and this is what I'm talking about, the carbon reduction plan being an element of that, because a carbon reduction plan giving you information about the suppliers, which you can then make use of for lots of other decisions, as well as then getting a contract, is also giving information that you can draw on in order to be able to identify where your hotspots are. And then obviously measuring on what is your specific Scope 3 emissions total. There are like various articles that are out there which have done, and I'll draw attention to one which I used, which was in the Lancet a couple of years ago. It broke down all of the Scope 3 emissions, actually all the emissions, Scope 1, 2 and 3, for the healthcare world, which is really helpful in terms of showing where all of the relevant Scope 3 emissions would sit within those various categories. So again, that's a really good place to start. And I think the other thing as well is that it is a journey. It's a very fast journey. It's a journey that's going to pick up speed, but it is a journey. So I think it's one of those things, and I'll probably get the phrase wrong, but you don't want perfection to get in the way of good. This is not about getting everything to be absolutely perfect before you move on. Just get it good and doing a decent job and then move on. You do not need to have everything perfect, because we don't have the time. But quite frankly, look out the window. We don't have the time. We need to move on very quickly. And again, don't beat yourselves up about it. It's, you know, it is that seeking help, seeking partnership, seeking advice from other people, not necessarily waiting for other people to, or having to come up with all the answers yourselves. Okay, so that was us. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.